The meteorological forecast gave the destroyer 7 hours. 7 hours before Typhoon Mawar's outer wall reached the ship's current position in the Philippine Sea, 310 nautical miles east of Luzon. The central pressure of Typhoon Mawar at 4 a.m. was 898 hectopascals. The maximum sustained winds at the eye wall were 285 kilometers per hour. The wave height inside the outer rain bands was already 6.8 meters and would reach 11 to 14 meters as the outer wall passed. Ships in the path of a Category 4 typhoon did not choose to remain in the path. They accelerated away from the track, maximized their separation from the storm center, and found navigable water. The destroyer's commanding officer had been tracking Mawar for 31 hours. The storm had accelerated overnight, advancing 60 nautical miles faster than the 48-hour forecast had predicted. At 4 a.m., the decision point had arrived. The ship needed to begin its evasion course immediately to maintain acceptable clearance from the outer eye wall or accept progressively worse conditions as the storm's expansion radius extended. Every hour of delay tightened the geometry of escape. The destroyer was also the sole escort for a 7-vessel logistics convoy 14 nautical miles to the southwest, making 12 knots on a bearing toward Subic Bay. The convoy had been notified of the typhoon and was on emergency transit heading. The convoy vessels could not outrun Mawar. Their best speed was 14 to 16 knots, and the typhoon was advancing at 22 knots on a track that would intercept the convoy's course in approximately 19 hours. The convoy needed to reach Subic Bay, 280 nautical miles away, before the storm arrived. At 14 knots, it would make it. Barely. The convoy commodore had 280 nautical miles to transit. The destroyer had a choice: escort the convoy toward port while the typhoon closed from behind, or execute an independent evasion that took the destroyer out of the storm track at the cost of leaving the convoy without air defense coverage. The choice had seemed abstract at 4 a.m. At 4:17 a.m., it became concrete. The SPY-6 resolved 50 contacts, bearing 298 to 323, range 62 to 71 kilometers, altitude 380 to 420 meters, speed 185 kilometers per hour. One-way attack UAV platforms. The approach bearing placed them on a direct vector toward the convoy's position and the destroyer's current location. The adversary had chosen this window deliberately. The destroyer committed to typhoon evasion was a destroyer that had abandoned its defensive position. The adversary had been monitoring the weather and had timed the launch for the exact window when the evasion decision was most acute. If the destroyer executed typhoon evasion now, the 50 contacts would reach the convoy uncontested. The convoy had no defensive weapons. A 50-platform one-way attack engagement against undefended logistics vessels at close range was not an engagement. It was a sequence of impacts with no meaningful defensive response. If the destroyer held position and engaged the 50 contacts, it would be fighting in Beaufort 9 to 10 conditions that were deteriorating toward Beaufort 11 as Mawar's outer bands advanced. The sea state was already 6.8 meters. The wind was 47 to 55 knots and increasing. The SPY-6 clutter suppression was in emergency high sea state mode. The ESSM illuminator was operating in a sea state compensated mode that the system's design team had validated up to Beaufort 8. Beaufort 10 was outside the validated performance envelope. The commanding officer made the decision in 94 seconds. We stay, we fight, convoy maintains transit heading, we engage the contacts, running count. 4:17 a.m., second 050, UAV contacts, bearing 298 to 323, range 62 to 71 kilometers, 185 kilometers per hour, Altitude 380 to 420 meters. Sea state, Beaufort 9 to 10. Wave height 6.8 meters. Wind 47 to 55 knots. SPY-6, emergency high sea state mode. ESSM illuminator, outside validated Beaufort 10 envelope. Typhoon Mawar 7 hours to outer wall. Convoy 14 nautical miles southwest, no defensive weapons. SM-6-8, SM-2 24, ESSM 32, RAM 21, CIWS 100%. Cost $0. The engagement plan in Beaufort 10 conditions required applying every weather degradation factor from the Arctic engagement series and then exceeding them. In the Arctic engagement, the sea state had been Beaufort 8. The ESSM hit probability had fallen to 67%. The SPY-6 had been at 40% detection efficiency. The CIWS had experienced barrel icing and FLIR contamination. Beaufort 10 conditions produced wave heights 40 to 60% larger than Beaufort 8. The SPY-6 clutter return from 6.8 meter seas was not a linear extrapolation from the Beaufort 8 baseline. It was a qualitative shift into a clutter environment where the sea surface return was merging with the lowest altitude contact returns in a way that the clutter suppression algorithm had not been designed to handle. The SPY-6's engineering specifications listed Beaufort 8 as the maximum sea state for standard performance assurance. Beaufort 10 was outside the envelope. The SM-6 active radar seeker in terminal phase faced the same sea clutter problem as the SPY-6 amplified by the higher wave heights. Estimated hit probability modifier, minus 20 percentage points in Beaufort 10 versus the standard 82%. Estimated SM-6 hit rate, 62%. The SM-2 semi-active guidance with ship-based illuminator. The ship's pitch cycle in Beaufort 10 was 14 to 18 degrees at 8 to 10 second periods. The illuminator's signal loss window per pitch cycle, 3.5 to 5 seconds. At a 9-second period, the illuminator was unavailable for approximately 40% of each engagement cycle. SM-2 hit probability estimate, 55% minus 22 percentage points from Beaufort 10 illuminator degradation. Effective SM-2 hit rate, 53%. The ESSM in Beaufort 10 with 40% illuminator availability hit probability estimate 48% per round, down from the standard 82 to 86%. This was the most significant single system degradation. The ESSM was the middle ring's primary weapon. At 48% effectiveness, the middle ring was operating at just over half its standard capacity. The CIWS in Beaufort 10. Barrel elevation geometry at extreme sea state required the mounts to compensate for ship motion beyond their standard stabilization envelope. In 6.8 meter seas, the ship's roll cycle was 16 to 20 degrees at 9 to 11 second periods. The CIWS autogyro could track within 12 degrees of ship motion with full accuracy. At 16 to 20 degrees, the system entered a degraded tracking mode for 2 to 3 seconds at each roll extreme. The FLIR was contaminated by spray at a rate faster than the self-cleaning cycle. CIWS estimated effectiveness 72% versus the standard 95%. The math at these degraded rates against 50 contacts. SM-6, 8 cells at 62%, 4.96 expected intercepts. Call it 5. SM-2, 24 cells at 53%, 12.72 expected intercepts. Call it 13. ESSM, 32 cells at 48%, 15.36 expected intercepts. Call it 15. RAM, 21 cells at 80%. RAM's passive infrared seeker was less affected by sea state. 16.8 expected intercepts. Call it 17. CIWS estimated 8 to 10 contacts at 72% per attempt. Total estimated defensive capacity: 5 plus 13 plus 15 plus 17 plus 9 equals 59, against 50 contacts. On paper, the math closed. On paper, with 9 contacts to spare in the theoretical capacity count. The TAO had studied these numbers for exactly 94 seconds before the commanding officer ordered engagement. He had noted what the paper math did not capture. The 5 layers of degradation were cumulative, not sequential. A contact that survived the SM-6 outer ring in Beaufort 10 was not a standard contact entering the SM-2 layer. It was a contact that had demonstrated it was harder to track than average in these conditions, because the contacts that the SM-6 missed would disproportionately be the contacts exhibiting the behaviors that caused mices in sea clutter, sea skimming, low-altitude approaches, contacts that descended into wave troughs at the terminal engagement point. Those same characteristics made them harder for SM-2, harder for ESSM, and harder for CIWS. The 9-contact theoretical margin existed on the assumption that the miss pattern was random. It was not random. The misses would cluster in the subset of contacts that were hardest to track in these conditions, and those contacts would cascade through the rings at above average rates. He said this to the commanding officer in the 94 seconds. He received the order to engage. Running count, 4:19 a.m., second 113, engagement ordered. Weather degradation applied, SM-6 hit estimated. 62%, SM-2 hit estimated. 53%, ESSM hit est, 48%, RAM 80%, CIWS 72%, theoretical capacity 59 contacts versus 50 inbound, cascade risk above average, SPY-6 emergency mode, convoy 14 nautical miles southwest, holding course, cost $0. SM-6 cells 1 through 6 launched at 4:24 a.m. against 6 contacts at 62 to 68 kilometers. In the 6 seconds of SM-6 launch sequence, the ship rolled 14 degrees to starboard and began recovery. The VLS launch system absorbed the roll without effect, the missiles burning northwest into the pre-dawn darkness above the storm-driven sea. 3 intercepts, 3 misses. The predicted 62% hit rate had delivered exactly its statistical expectation on the first salvo. The 3 misses, 2 contacts that had descended into wave troughs at SM-6 terminal engagement, and 1 contact whose radar cross-section had merged with a sea return clutter spike in the terminal basket, causing the seeker to acquire the wrong target. SM-6 cells 7 and 8 against 2 contacts at 59 kilometers. 1 intercept, 1 miss. SM-6 inventory, 0. 46 contacts remaining. Running count, 4:25 a.m., second 487. SM-6, 0, 4 of 8 intercepts. 46 contacts at 46 to 58 kilometers. Pitch cycle, 18 degrees, model was 14 degrees. SM-2, 24. ESSM, 32. RAM, 21. CIWS, 100%. Typhoon, 6 hours, 52 minutes to outer wall. Wind, 49 knots. Wave height, 7.1 meters. Cost, $16.8 million. Time, 8 minutes. The SM-2 engagement in Beaufort 10 was the engagement's central drama. 24 cells, 46 contacts at 42 to 56 kilometers. The illuminator's 40% unavailability meant that of the 12 seconds required for a standard SM-2 engagement, approximately 4.8 seconds would be conducted with degraded or absent illumination. The fire control system compensated by extending the terminal seeker's search pattern: wider basket, lower per intercept confidence, but more coverage of the target's probable position. SM-2 cells 1 through 8, 8 contacts at 44 to 52 kilometers, 3 intercepts, 5 misses. The miss rate of 62.5% was significantly worse than the estimated 47% miss rate. The sea state-driven illuminator gaps had been longer than the model predicted in the first salvo. The pitch cycle was now 18 degrees rather than the 14-degree baseline used in the estimate, and an 18-degree pitch produced illuminator gaps of 4.5 to 5.5 seconds versus the modeled 3.5 to 4 seconds. 38 contacts remaining. Running count: 4:27 a.m., second 614, SM-60, SM-2, 16 remaining. 38 contacts at 32 to 44 kilometers. Pitch cycle, 18 degrees, illuminator gaps, 4.5 to 5.5 seconds per cycle. ESSM, 32, RAM, 21. CIWS, 100%. Convoy, 14.2 nautical miles southwest, no damage. Typhoon, 6 hours, 41 minutes to outer wall. Cost, $18.0 million. Time, 10 minutes. SM-2 cells 9 through 18. 10 cells against 10 contacts at 34 to 42 kilometers. 5 intercepts, 5 misses. The miss rate consistent with the higher than modeled illuminator degradation. SM-2 cells 19 through 24, 6 cells. 2 intercepts, 4 misses. SM-2 inventory, 0. 31 contacts remaining at 22 to 34 kilometers. Running count: 4:30 a.m., second 782, SM-60, SM-2, 0. 31 contacts at 22 to 34 kilometers. SM-2 actual hit rate, 41%, model 53%. Cascade effect confirmed. Survivors disproportionately sea skimmers. ESSM, 32. RAM, 21. CIWS, 100%. Typhoon, 6 hours, 47 minutes to outer wall. Wave height, 7.4 meters. Cost, $36.0 million. Time, 13 minutes. 31 contacts surviving 2 outer rings that had been expected to neutralize 18. The theoretical margin of 9 contacts above capacity had evaporated before the middle ring opened. The ESSM at 48% hit probability. 32 cells against 31 contacts would theoretically produce 15 intercepts. 15 intercepts from 31 contacts left 16 reaching the RAM and CIWS layers. Against RAM at 80% and CIWS at 72%, 17 RAM intercepts and 10 to 12 CIWS intercepts. The math had gone from 9 contacts of margin to a theoretical deficit. ESSM cells 1 through 16 against 16 contacts at 14 to 22 kilometers. 6 intercepts, 10 misses. The ESSM hit rate in Beaufort 10, with the extended illuminator gaps, was performing at 37.5%, below the already degraded estimate of 48%. The cascade effect the TAO had identified was manifesting. The contacts surviving the outer rings were disproportionately the low-altitude sea skimmers, and the contacts executing altitude dips into wave troughs. Against those contacts, the ESSM's basket placement errors were larger, its seeker acquisition more uncertain, and its proximity fuse geometry more likely to produce near misses. ESSM cells 17 through 28, 12 cells against 12 contacts, 4 intercepts, 8 misses. ESSM remaining, 4 cells. Running count, 4:34 a.m., second 1021. ESSM, 0, actual hit rate, 37.5%, model 48%. SM-60, SM-2, 0. 21 contacts at 3 to 8 kilometers. RAM, 21. CIWS, 100%. Sea skimmer cascade confirmed as primary survivor mechanism. Typhoon, 6 hours, 43 minutes to outer wall. Cost, $50.4 million. Time, 17 minutes. 21 contacts inside 8 kilometers. Running count, 4:32 a.m., second 905, ESSM, 4 remaining, SM6, 0, SM2, 0. 21 contacts at 3 to 8 kilometers. RAM, 21. CIWS, 100%. ESSM, actual, hit rate, 37.5%, model, 48%. Sea state, deteriorating. Wave height, 7.4 meters. Wind, 52 knots. Convoy, 14.6 nautical miles southwest. Cost, $36.0 million. Time, 15 minutes. Running count, 4:34 a.m., second 1021, ESSM 0. Actual hit rate, 37.5%, model 48%. SM6 0, SM2 0. 21 contacts at 3 to 8 kilometers. RAM 21. CIWS 100%. Sea skimmer cascade confirmed as primary survivor mechanism. Typhoon, 6 hours, 43 minutes to outer wall. Cost, $50.4 million. Time, 17 minutes. 21 contacts inside 8 kilometers. 4 ESSM cells and 21 RAM cells for the close range. The RAM's passive infrared seeker had been the most weather-resilient system throughout, and it showed the first 12 RAM cells against 12 contacts at 4.2 to 7.8 kilometers produced 10 intercepts and 2 misses, an 83% hit rate that was within the modeled expectation and dramatically better than the radar-guided systems had performed. The last 4 ESSM cells against 4 contacts at 5 to 7 kilometers, 2 intercepts, 2 misses. ESSM inventory, 0. RAM cells 13 through 21 against 9 contacts at 2.4 to 5.1 kilometers. 7 intercepts, 2 misses. RAM inventory, 0. 2 contacts inside 2 kilometers. Both were the sea skimmers, the contacts that had been descending through the engagement from 380 meters altitude to below 30 meters, the contacts that had defeated 5 SM6, 14 SM2, and 11 ESSM intercept attempts on their way through the rings. CIWS forward acquired the first contact at 1,900 meters, altitude 18 meters. The contact was at 18 meters in 6.8 meter seas. Wave heights of 6.8 meters meant the contact was spending approximately 40% of each wave cycle at or below the radar horizon from the CIWS tracking radar's perspective. The waves themselves were obscuring the contact between crests. The CIWS tracking computer lost the contact twice in the final 400 meters of approach, reacquired both times on the rising contact above the wave crest. First burst, 1.6 seconds, 120 rounds. The contact was at 1,400 meters when the burst was complete. The CIWS had fired into the probable position envelope based on track extrapolation through the 2 acquisition gaps. The actual contact position was 60 meters from the center of the burst cone. 11 rounds of the 120 were assessed as impacting the airframe. The contact continued. Second burst, 1.1 seconds, 82 rounds. The contact was at 900 meters. The burst was better centered. The tracking computer had updated its sea state model based on the first burst feedback. Contact fragmented at 800 meters. Warhead initiated. At 800 meters in Beaufort 10 conditions, the overpressure wave arrived at the hull simultaneously with a 7-meter wave breaking across the bow. The combined physical event, warhead overpressure, plus major wave impact, was recorded by the Motion Reference Unit as a 2.1 G impact event, the highest recorded in the ship's operational history. Equipment secured for heavy weather shifted. 2 crew members at unsecured stations fell. Temporary structural deformation of a forward frame member was noted in the post-engagement assessment. CIWS aft acquired the second sea skimmer at 2,100 meters. Altitude 22 meters. Same tracking challenge. Wave cycle acquisition loss, extrapolated track, interrupted burst. Burst sequence, 2.0 seconds, 1.4 seconds. The contact fragmented at 1,600 meters on the second burst. Warhead initiated. Overpressure at 1,600 meters in Beaufort. 10 conditions produced a pressure event that reached the hull as a sharp, distinct impact beneath the continuous noise of the Typhoon's outer bands. The first time in the engagement that crew members had needed to consciously distinguish a combat event from the weather. Running count. 4:38 a.m., second 1,241, all 50 contacts, neutralized. 2 warhead detonations at 800 meters and 1,600 meters. CIWS used 2 bursts on each contact due to sea state tracking loss. SM6 0, SM2 0, ESSM 0, RAM 0, CIWS 4, 61% aft 68%. Hull 2.1 grams impact event, forward frame deformation. 2 crew minor injuries, unsecured stations. Typhoon Mawar, 6 hours 19 minutes to outer wall. Convoy, intact. Cost, $56.4 million. Time, 21 minutes. All 50 contacts were neutralized. The convoy was intact. The engagement was over. The magazine assessment at 4:44 a.m. SM60 of 8, SM20 of 24, ESSM 0 of 32, RAM 0 of 21, CIWS forward 61%, CIWS aft 68%. Every missile inventory had been fully expended. The ship was operating on 2 partially loaded CIWS mounts in conditions that were deteriorating toward Beaufort 11 as Typhoon Mawar's outer bands advanced. The damage assessment at 5 a.m. Forward frame member deformation at the bow structure. Structural, above the waterline, not affecting hull integrity or flooding risk, but requiring shipyard evaluation before the ship could certify full structural rating under heavy weather operations. 2 crew members, one with a wrist sprain from a fall during the 2.1 G event, one with bruised ribs from the same event, both on limited duty. No other personnel effects. The commanding officer had the evasion course computed before the damage assessment was complete. The evasion course required 28 knots sustained for 6 hours to maintain adequate separation from Typhoon Mawar's outer wall. The convoy could not match 28 knots. Convoy had reached a position 46 nautical miles closer to Subic Bay during the engagement. Its transit was on schedule. At 14 knots, the convoy would reach port in approximately 17 hours, clearing the storm's approach by approximately 2 hours of margin if the Typhoon maintained its predicted track. The destroyer could not escort the convoy at 28 knots without leaving it behind. It could escort the convoy at 14 knots with increasing sea state and deteriorating conditions through the outer Typhoon bands. We stay with the convoy. 14 knots. Maintain escort position. The commanding officer made the second decision in 8 seconds. The engagement had been the first decision. This was its consequence. The supply officer assembled the accounting at 7 a.m. 50 shad, 136 one-way attack platforms at $20,000 each. $1 million. Launch logistics and weather window targeting, $80,000. Total adversary investment, approximately $1.08 million. U.S. munitions expended, 8 SM6 at $2.1 million to $16.8 million. 24 SM2 at $1.2 million to $28.8 million. 32 ESSM at $450,000 to $14.4 million. 21 RAM at $900,000 to $18.9 million. CIWS, $49,000. Total, $78.9 million. Exchange ratio, 73 to 1 in the adversary's favor, the highest ratio in the engagement record since the AI swarm engagement at 73 to 1. The Beaufort 10 weather degradations had driven the interceptor count significantly above what a standard conditions engagement would have required. The difference from a theoretical clear weather engagement with the same 50 contacts, approximately $18 to $22 million in additional interceptors attributable to weather degradation. The adversary had purchased those additional interceptors for the cost of monitoring the weather forecast and timing the launch to Typhoon Mawar's approach window. The weather window had cost them nothing beyond the surveillance. The typhoon was free. The post-engagement analysis noted the cascade effect had been more severe than the TAO's model had predicted. In standard conditions, the miss probability was assumed to be uniformly distributed across contacts. In Beaufort 10, the miss probability was not uniform. It was heavily weighted toward the low-altitude sea-skimming contacts that the sea clutter penalized most severely. Those contacts cascaded through every ring at above-average survival rates, concentrating the final combat load in the CIWS layer. The two contacts that reached CIWS range were not random survivors. They were the two contacts that had been optimally configured to exploit the exact degradation mechanism that Beaufort 10 produced. Whether the adversary had designed the low-altitude contacts specifically to exploit sea-state CIWS degradation, or whether the cascade was a consequence of general threat characteristics in heavy sea engagements, was not determinable from the engagement data. The effect was identical in either case. Emergency resupply transmitted at 6:30 a.m. Full VLS reload, RAM replenishment, ETA, 6 days, weather dependent. The logistics vessel could not transit into the outer typhoon band. 6 days minimum. 6 days. 0 missiles. 2 CIWS mounts at 61 and 68%. Beaufort 11 conditions advancing. The convoy had 17 hours to Subic Bay. The destroyer had 6 hours until Mawar's outer wall. Both timelines were running simultaneously, and neither waited for the other. At 4:38 a.m., the engagement had ended. At 4:38 a.m., the typhoon had continued advancing. The engagement and the weather had never been separate problems. They had been one problem from the moment the adversary checked the forecast and made their launch decision. 50 drones and a typhoon. The drones cost $1.08 million. The typhoon was free. Together, they had produced the highest exchange ratio in the engagement record and left a warship with no missiles navigating into the outer bands of a Category 4 storm for the next 6 hours. The adversary had read the weather report. That was enough.